Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to our Wing Wednesday webinar series. As you know, this takes place on the fourth Wednesday of every month. Dr. Elisa Fuentes Montemayor. I'm a senior lecturer in applied ecology. I'm based at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And until recently, I was one of Bats Without Borders board members. And I'm going to be your host for today. I would like to remind you that our webinars are free to ensure that everyone can join, but we have limited funding to run these webinars. So we would ask you, if you are in a position to donate, you can do that on our website. You can become a friend of Bats Without Borders, or you can give a one-off donation. But what we'd like to highlight this week in particular is that we have the Big Give Christmas Challenge coming up soon. So this is taking place between the 3rd to the 10th of December. And we really need as many donations as possible during this period of time through the specific link that's going to be posted on the chat briefly. And if you donate during that time period, we can get match funding for those donations. So we really appreciate that. On your screens, you can now see a QR code. And this is a link that takes you to our Bats Without Borders WhatsApp group. If you would like to join to keep in touch with our latest news and updates, please scan the code on the screen just now. And also just a reminder that you can catch up on any of our previous webinars that you may have missed on our YouTube channel. So we've had 50 webinars already. And you can also find out more about any of our upcoming webinars and other events if you visit our webpage. Our webinars run from March to November, so this is our last one of this year, but we will be back in March 2025. So please keep an eye out for upcoming seminars and webinars next year. And before I hand over to our speaker for today, I'd just like to remind you that just for sound quality and internet stability, we ask you to please keep your microphones on mute and your videos off. And we will welcome your questions, so please just write them in the chat through the presentation, and I will read them out at the end of the talk. And also just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded so that we can post it on our YouTube channel later on. Okay, so today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Hernani Oliveira as today's speaker. Hernani has worked across the tropics worldwide towards understanding multiple aspects of the ecology and conservation of different animal groups, mostly focused on mammals and more specifically on bats. And to do so, he integrates myriads of techniques ranging from DNA barcoding to camera traps, and he applies various analytical methods, including geometric morphometrics and network analysis. And today he's going to be talking to us about the conservation of neotropical cave-dwelling bats. So over to you, Hernani. Really looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. Hello, Elise. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here again. I think I'm the first speaker to be twice, for the first time. The first the first person who have spoken twice, in Winged Wednesdays. Can you see my screen? Just checking, in the.
No, I think I was still sharing mine. So if you can try and share yours just now, please.
Can you see it now?
That's on now in presentation mode. Great.
Yeah. So yeah, it's good to be the first speaker to be speaking twice, here in Winged Wednesdays. Also, conservation of neotropical cave-dwelling bats, one of the lines of research that I have. So I'll be speaking with you about not only the conservation, but also a bit of their ecology for you to understand better some of their aspects to think about their conservation as well. So first thing is that I think we need to understand first what I'm telling here as calling here as Neotropical, because there are different biogeographic regions and they have different categories. So basically I'm saying, when I say Neotropical here, I'm referring to basically mostly the Latin America. So the whole Latin America is what I'm calling here as a biogeographic region as Neotropical. There are some difference depending on different studies and different researches, but for here, I'm considering Neotropical basically the whole Latin American part of the Americas. And I think everybody knows about it, everybody who understands a little bit about biological distribution of species, but it's a highly diverse region of the planet, which has basically for most taxa, one of the most diverse places on Earth, at least in terms of number of species. If you compare it in terms of area, it might lose to Southeast Asia because Neotropical region is much bigger than Indo-Malayan region or Southeast Asia, but we have much more species. So it's the most biological diverse place on Earth if you don't account like into the area, into the equation. Also, it's good to have an idea about what's the distribution of bat species worldwide. So if this is a rough estimation that Nancy Simmons did in the first Winged Wednesdays webinar about the species richness of bats across the world. And you can see here that bat species richness in South America, in Latin America in general, is also pretty high in comparable to Southeast Asia and the other tropical places as Africa as well. But it's a comparable size as well. But we have a very high estimation of bat species richness here. But now we don't know a lot about still the distribution of these species that happen only in caves. So this is a study that published in 2022, which started to give a rough estimate according to some measures from IUCN, but also some measures that we got from different studies to compare how is the distribution of bat species, cave-dwelling bat species worldwide according to the different biogeographic regions. So you can see here that also not only the Neotropical region is very rich in terms of bat species, but also very rich in terms of cave-dwelling bat species. So we're only behind Indo-Malayan region again, or more or less Southeast Asia. It's equals to more or less Southeast Asia. We also have some level of endemism, but not so high as other regions. So we're behind like other regions on that. And we have a lot of threatened species. Probably the most threatened cave-dwelling bat species biogeographic region in the world is actually the Neotropical region. I'm saying this most of the time probably because we are still very behind in terms of understanding first the distribution of caves or karsts, which I'm using here as the same thing for this talk. So caves and karsts are the same thing here. So we don't know exactly the distribution of caves worldwide, and this hinders our ability to understand the distribution of cave-dwelling bat species worldwide. So basically everything that I'm saying here, you need to be aware that it's an estimation or it's the best estimation that we have right now, but this might switch a lot across time as much as we discover new caves and also new bat cave species within these caves as well. One thing that is important as well to understand is that bats seem to have evolved as well to this condition. So in this study from Chris, here they evaluated some 20 bat species, mostly Neotropical, and they saw that the species that are more related with cave roosting, they have actually lost opsin related genes, which have led them to not seeing some types of colors. So cave bat species in the Neotropics, they seem to be color blind, more than they have lost like the ability to see some colors related to non-cave-dwelling bat species, which seems that they have heavily adapted for these kind of landscapes across this distribution. We need to further evaluate this for the species as well, but what this study have showed initially is that probably due to their spending so much time in so much darkness, which is actually usually the type of environment that the caves they offer for the bats, together with hunting and being active at night, they have lost the ability or lost the possibility to see the colors apart from UV, ultraviolet light, and also different shades of black and white, which makes sense to think that they are hunting at night. But it's important to remember that some bats can see pretty well during the nighttime. They can actually even hunt during using their eyesight. So this is important to take into account as well. This is a map, rough distribution of caves worldwide. So you can see that there are caves basically almost everywhere on the planet. And the place that are not marked with the pink spots is basically probably because no one has ever gone there and never been there and never see or never searched for caves and actually detected them. So just for you to have an idea, in Brazil, which mostly, well, most of the caves are concentrated here in the center of the country. We have been estimated to have here around 300,000 caves, and so far we have discovered only 23,000 caves. So we know today less than 10% of the caves that are estimated to happen in Brazil. So you can have an idea about how underestimated probably this map is. And also you can see here the Amazon in the northwest part of the Brazil, which here in this map doesn't have any caves, and it's basically I think that that's basically because most of the Amazon is still very hard to reach and very hard to study, especially for caves as well. But here we have made an estimation based on the caves that we know that they have bats. Like, so this is another thing as well. We don't know where the caves are, and we know even less about which bat species are in these caves, because the number of caves that have been sampled for bats are even lower than the number of caves that we know already. So just for you to have an idea, here in Brazil, which will be the basis for many of my comparisons, but I'm trying to get pictures from all around the world based on studies that I have published as well with prisoner Tanalgo. So here in Brazil, we have estimated around 500 caves that have been sampled for bats. So out of these 23,000, we have only 500 caves that have been sampled for bats. So you have an idea that from this whole world of caves, we only have an idea for the patterns that we're describing here today. They're based on only very few caves that have been sampled for bats. Of course, these caves, other caves might be empty, they might not be occupied by bats, but it's important to understand that we know very little still about cave-dwelling bats worldwide, but also here in the Neotropics. But if you pick these caves that we have studied here in this paper, most of the caves are actually in the tropics. So you can see that 58% of them happen across the tropics, and the Neotropical region are responsible for around 28% of the sample of the caves that have that are within our sampling size. So roughly 1/3 of the caves that we have estimated, we have found evidence that bats have been occurring in them. They are found here in the Neotropical region. It's not something that we can just ignore. It's very representative of the whole caves worldwide, and studies of caves, of bat cave-dwelling species in terms of the representativity, the Neotropical region is very well represented in this sense. It's also important to remember, I'm going to give you first some insights and information and thoughts, like for you to think about it as well, like the conservation, distribution, and ecology of cave-dwelling bat species. So this is a study that Stanimira Deleva was a PhD student in Bulgaria, published it. I was a co-author as well, and she was reviewing all the information for cave species in Costa Rica. And it's always important to know that bats are not the only things that we can find in caves, we can find in caves. There are also a lot of other different things. Some of them have evolved even more specialized in caves as well, such as the species that only happen in caves, some fishes, some arthropods, which the conservation of caves for them is paramount. So it's essential. If the caves disappear, they're also going to disappear. This is not necessarily the same for bats, because some bat species that occur in caves, they might have the ability to also roost in other places as well, while others, some species might not. So we have to distinguish, that I'm going to do in the future as well, the ability of cave bats in terms of the relationship with caves, in terms of the dependency on caves. So here we have also different estimations of different species, which they have different associations and dependency on these caves as well. But I just wanted to give a quick glimpse that when you go to a cave, very rarely you only find bats, and bats are actually one of the main sources of nutrients for most of these other species, since they go to the outside of the caves and they eat, they feed, and they bring back a lot of nutrients to the caves in terms of the guano or the feces that they poop and they defecate inside the caves. So bats are an essential part of the ecosystems of caves because they bring a lot of nutrients that will feed other animals, that might potentially feed other animals. So the whole food chain within a cave has in part or totally based on bats. As they die as well, they might feed other creatures as well, like, but mostly their poop and the guano are super important for maintaining a whole ecosystem. And if you're endangering the bats, they're endangering the whole ecosystem in the caves. And if you're endangering the caves, they're also endangering the bats and the whole ecosystem, which is something important. This relationship between cave conservation and bat conservation are intertwined between them. And that's something I'm going to talk a little bit more during the talk as well. But it's important for you to have these intertwining relationships and dependencies on conservation, not only for the caves, but also for the bats and vice versa. So I think first to understand a bit about the conservation of cave-dwelling bats, we need to understand a bit about their ecology and distribution as well, which is something that there are not a lot of studies out there. I think I've actually conducted the first one to evaluate macroecology of cave-dwelling bat species worldwide, I guess. Like, in this case, what we did is that we evaluated latitudinal distribution and elevational distribution of cave-dwelling bat species here in Brazil. So we see that for their distribution, the latitude, they have a mid-elevational peak. So they peak at mid-latitude peaks. So at mid-latitudes, they have a peak in terms of species richness, which decrease afterwards. And then regarding the elevation, there's also an elevational peak in the beginning of the low elevations, but then peaks again in higher elevations, which might be related with different aspects of their distribution, such as humidity, pulverosity, and the thermoregulation ability as well. I don't know if you know or have you thought about this, but not all bat species thermoregulate the same way. They have different abilities in terms of this, which may also affect their composition within caves. And it's also one of the things that makes caves important for them, because caves tend to be a very stable, thermally speaking, environments that they can roost and also safe from predators in general, although there are some cases that can be potentially traps for bats because some predators might go inside. This is related with the abundance of bats, so within caves here in Brazil. So they pretty much, the species richness and abundance, they peak at similar points. So more or less at 200 meters. And the abundance here also has, in terms of the latitude, has also two different peaks that's within like a first close to the equator, but then when you go far to the equator, the species richness starts to peak again. And you might be thinking, why species richness of cave bat species peak towards the equator, and then further down, like the equator, it also peaks again. And one of the explanations that I have, like at least one of the things that I thought, is related with this figure here. So you can see here that species richness and species abundance of cave-dwelling bat species in Brazil are not evenly distributed across different habitats or different environments, different vegetation types. And one of the main vegetation types that it peaks is within the Brazilian savannas. So it's they're open environments where bats don't have, or at least visually speaking, I cannot think too many places where a bat can roost. So I think for environments that are more open, caves, they play a more important environment for bats to roost, which might increase the importance for them as for their conservation, since in open savannas, where can you roost? I mean, you don't have trees for foliage roosting bats. You don't have hollow trees, big hollow trees, because most of the trees are low in terms of size or tall or height. So I think that's my hypothesis. I haven't tested it yet, but these graphs here, they've given us an idea that open environments, they might be more important. Caves might be more important in open environments because bats might not have other places to roost in comparison with forest environments such as the Amazon, the Atlantic rainforest, or the kind of forest or tall forests as well. So you can see here that Brazilian savannas, bats reach higher species richness in comparison to inside caves. Obviously, everything that I'm going to say about here about cave species bat species are related with that cave dwelling. So they have higher species richness in comparison to Amazon, to the Atlantic rainforest, but they also have higher abundance in comparison to the Atlantic rainforest and the scrubby forest, which is also another type of open environment here in Brazil as well. One other important things for the conservation of bats that's related with their ecology is that what we have, Jennifer has found here in Brazil, is that the longer the cave projection, or the longest is the cave here in Brazil, the more species richness it has. So if you want to protect caves that are larger, you're more likely to be protecting more bat species that are living within them. So this is something that we need to take into account, because we don't know all bat species, the distribution of bat species within caves. But if you know more or less, or you know, sometimes don't have time or money to sample them as well. But if you have more or less an estimation about the length of the cave, you can have an idea about how many potentially bat species might be there, or you know that there are more bat species than smaller caves. And that's basically usually because bats, they occur, or they occupy different places within each cave. So some species are more close to the entrance, some other species are more towards the end of the cave, which is darker. So bats occupy different places within each cave as well. And also, interestingly, here in Brazil, Jennifer also found that we have different types of caves as well. So not all caves are made of the same material. So there are carbonate caves, caves of iron, magmatic, siliciclastic caves. And Jennifer found also here in Brazil that they also host different species richness of bats. So that's also something important to take into account if you're protecting a cave, or thinking about protecting a cave, before knowing which bat species are there, that they might be hosting different bat species, or at least different species richness of bats, which you should take into account for their conservation. Now, I was talking previously, bat species, they have different associations with caves. So what Jennifer has done here again is that she evaluated the frequency of bats within caves. So for the next slides, I'm going to be talking as cave-dwelling bat species as a bat that occur in caves. But we know that that's not the case, because not all bats that have been found in caves are strictly cave-dwelling bat species. They might be roosting also in tree hollows, under foliage. So this might vary a lot. So what she has found here in Brazil is that actually is the minority of bat species that are actually primarily cave-dwelling. So they only occur, or they would only be roosting in caves and not anywhere else. And within these species, these 13 species here in Brazil that are among the primarily cave-dwelling, or they occur here in Brazil in more than 10% of the caves that have been sampled for bats. There are also 3 endangered species. And I'm talking later about specifically more about status of Oncophila dequeceri here in the Cerrados of Brazil. So we need to treat these species differently, right? Because if you affect the species that can only occur in a cave, and your cave gets destroyed, or is affected by mining, deforestation, you might be eventually able to roost in another place. But for these species that only happen in caves, or only roost in caves, if you destroy a cave, you're basically dooming the species to or local extinction, regional extinction, depends on the level of the effects that you have, like on that landscape and that caves as well. It's important to understand that we have different species richness of bat species, cave-dwelling bat species worldwide as well. So you can see here in the tropics, neotropics, that we, as I have said before, we are very well represented. So it's one of the most diverse places on Earth, followed by, actually, well, sorry, Indomalaya is the most diverse, but it's followed by the neotropics. But it's a general trend that most species are least concerned in different biogeographic regions. We have some few species here that are considered threatened, but most of them are least concerned, basically, usually because they have very big, very large distribution ranges, and not necessarily because, locally speaking, they might be threatened or not. And we have different levels of different types of threats to this cave. So this is the evaluation of different threats for caves within a 1 kilometer resolution. So you can see in general that the Neotropical region, in terms of the threats to the caves themselves, as I have said before, we're dividing like a little bit the conservation of bats, but also conservation of caves, but they're intertwined between them. So the conservation of caves within the Neotropical region are doing pretty much better than other regions. So the canopy cover is higher than other places here. Tree density as well. Distance to bodies of water, well, is a little bit lower than other places. Bare ground change is not changed so much, at least in comparison to some other places. Vegetation cover change as well. So in comparison to other biogeographic regions, we're doing reasonably well, like in this sense. Apart from nightlight. So nightlight is one of the things that we have been, seems to be affecting, at least in terms of the 1 kilometer resolution around caves, more for neotropical bat species than for other bat species worldwide. But again, for the other threats, we're not the worst case scenario in terms of mine density, distance to roads, distance to urbanization, pesticide use, and population density, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be aware of these and should be making efforts to make things better for the conservation of bats, but in comparison to other places, we're not so bad for these threats. It's important to understand other aspects of the distribution of cave-dwelling bat species worldwide. So we are the most, we're the biogeographic region with the most evolutionarily distinct community of cave-dwelling bat species, which means that if you extinguish bat species here in Brazil or in the Neotropical region, you are probably extinguishing or extincting species that only happen here and don't have any related species in other genera or other places of the world. But again, when you see endemism, it's not so, we don't have a lot of endemic species in comparison to other places. In relation with extinction risk, neotropical bats are not so bad in terms of the level of threats like here in comparison to other places again. So they're not one of the most threatened biogeographic regions worldwide. But here comes an interesting thing that we have found, like in a study with Chris Tanalgo. We're comparing the biotic potential, but also biotic vulnerability across the world. We use it in the first two maps on the upper part, data from IUCN to map this, to estimate this. And the bottom ones, we use actually data from the studies that people have published in different places or have sent to us. And you can see here that in the first two maps, when you see BV is biotic vulnerability, so the threats, the Neotropical region is not so bad in relation with other biogeographic regions as well. But when you see about biotic potential or the number of species that might be happening there, we have a lot of more species that could be happening in different caves than other regions like in the world. But this is based on the IUCN data. So it's a broad scale evaluation, which doesn't take into account specificities of each region and in the data itself. But then in the bottom one maps, the two bottom maps, you can see more specifically how we evaluated, and you can see changes on these patterns in some ways. So biotic potential also remains high for the Neotropical region. So you can see here that caves in the Neotropical region might host more species than caves in other places. And also the level of threats seems to increase a little bit in relation to the other biogeographic regions. But you can see here the BV score. So there are some changes that you can see from going to the broad scale pattern to a more fine scale, where we're actually going through from the IUCN data to actually the data that we have digged from the authors that have contributed to the paper. Also, this is a prioritization for conservation of of caves worldwide. So you can see here that Neotropical region seems to be doing, in this case, a little bit worse than other regions, because you can see more species there, more caves that are yellow priority or red priority, which means they might be potentially threatened to different aspects of cave protection. But also, when you go to the fine scale data, where we only evaluated the caves with the contributors of the paper have sent data to us, you can see also that it massively increases the number of caves that should be more important in terms of their protection and should be taken into more care for their conservation. So we have talked a lot about the problems and the challenge that conservation of bat species, cave-dwelling bat species face worldwide. And what about the things that we can do to actually to try to fix these problems? So this paper from Mamula, they reviewed the the number of interventions that from the studies they have actually tried to do on bats according to the potential available intervention ones. And I have seen that in the tropical region, we haven't tested all the potential interventions, positive interventions for caves in relation to their conservation. So these would be things that could be potentially helping their conservation. We haven't done all that we can, and we're behind other biogeographic regions such as the Arctic, the Palearctic, and the Australasian, but also for tropical region. We are only in front of Indomalay in comparison to which kind of things we have done to try to fix the problems of the caves conservation. And this is for emphasized by this other study from Mammals, which shows them to protect such.
Hernani, I think we're losing you.
Facts of
I think you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Might be my internet here, my internet connection.
I think you're back. Okay. So yeah, it was only the last.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it was only the last 30 seconds or so that you started breaking up, but you're back, I think.
Okay. So I will repeat this last part. So the Neotropical region, according to this study from Amol as well, this other study, we haven't assessed like this. Studies haven't assessed or tested the cave bat cave in the Neotropical region. So most regulating access, protecting the cave, but also bat cave dwelling bat conservation. And habitats. And for bats, most of the conservation less than 50% of the conservation within caves, since they haven't been assessed for that yet. I think one thing important to remember that I haven't said in the beginning, that we have roughly around 40 to 50% of bat species worldwide have been found at least once or have been related to caves in the literature. Although we don't know necessarily on what are the level of association with these caves, if they're primarily cave dwelling, if they could be roosting in other places. This is a knowledge gap that we have. So this needs to be further emphasized and researched in the future. And some of the things that have been studied more in terms of interventions, positive interventions for cave conservation and bat cave conservation are risk assessments and monitoring, which are not something that we need to improve our understanding of how we can protect caves and cave bat species worldwide, because we are for sure not doing a very good job still in terms of not only understanding the conservation, but also understanding what we can do to improve the conservation within these regions. And also here in Latin America, we don't have data for all countries, or at least I don't know, I'm not aware of anywhere that this data is available. But here in Brazil, recently, 2 years ago, there has been a law that tried to deregulate cave conservation here in Brazil. So from 1990, all caves in Brazil were protected by law. 2008, there was a change in the law that they tried to pass that only maximum protected caves or maximum category caves should be protected, and all the other ones could be explored for mining and other different kinds of activities. And then in 2022, President Jair Bolsonaro tried to pass a law that allowed any cave of Brazil to be destroyed to some extent. So basically, any of the 23,000 there's a taxa. We know there are a lot of taxa that are specific happening only in some of these caves and not in any other cave. Sometimes only in one single cave there might be a species that only happen there. So it's a highly endemic situation. But we have been discussing this, and this seems to have been. I think we're still on the discussion of this, but I'm just saying this because there's a concrete pressure here in Brazil to decrease around 5% of Brazilian GDP, and it's an important part of the economy. We also can get calcium to make alkalium, to correct pH soil here for agriculture here in Brazil, which sometimes comes from caves as well. And also there's a lot of mining activity, and there's a lot of pressure for deregulating cave conservation and protection here in Brazil, which of course will affect the bats as well. And this is the last thing I think for the talk. I'm going to, this is a study case that I have done with endangered and endemic bat species from the cerrados of Brazil, from the savannas of Brazil. So from those that do not know, like savannas of Brazil, the Cerrado is the second largest biome, Neotropical biome, after the Amazon. We have roughly 2 million square kilometers, which is distributed mostly in the center of the country. It's mostly open. And Loconfila de Quesada is an endemic bat species that only happen in the savannas of Brazil, in the cerrados. And it's also considered endangered across, according to the IUCN. But there's no clear assessment of the conservation of this species. So what we have done is that we have created a distribution, we have modeled distribution of this species and overlapped it with the protected areas within its distribution to see what's the status of the distribution of this species, but also the caves within its distribution. So we have seen that it only has 15% of its distribution within protected areas. Most of this percentage is actually from not very strict protected areas because they have different regulation laws. So most of this distribution of this species is not in strict protected areas. And the caves, 50% of the caves of this species are actually within protected areas. But again, not all of them are very strictly protected because in terms of the law, in terms of the categories of the protected areas that they fall. So the situation is very, for this species in specific, it's very worrying. It's only known to roost in caves. We also found that for this species specific, the presence of a cave is very likely to increase the possibility that you have this species in the place. So it seems to be more dependent on caves than any other species that we have ever studied here in Brazil. Or at least we have evidence here in Brazil. And also mining activity is something very threatening for this species also. You can see here the overlap between the mining exploitations or the schedules or programs for mining activities to happen, and also the distribution of the species. So there's a very high overlap, I think it's above 50%. So there's a lot of overlap between mining exploration and the distribution of the species, but also the species threatened. We evaluated the conservation of the caves within its distribution to see if they are deforested, which kind of threats they have around the caves of this species. So the home range of Loconfila de Quesada is roughly the same size of a 1.5 kilometer radius from the cave. So we evaluated the status of these caves within its distribution regarding their land use change. So most of the caves are also converted to pasture, which pose another threat. So sometimes the cave might be there, but if all the vegetation around the cave is deforested, the species might not be able to roost there in the cave or to feed outside the cave. So there's also an additional threat that haven't been evaluated for many species as well, but it's super important, especially for species that are nectarivorous, such as this one, which depend on a lot of the resources on the landscape to move around and have a high metabolism, but also they are highly dependent on caves and the vegetation conservation. Usually here in the cerrados, if these species, if nectarivorous species, their habitat gets deforested, they basically get extinct or reduce a lot their abundance in the landscape. So we need to look into different layers of conservation, right? So cave conservation, bat conservation, the vegetation as well. They are intertwined in terms of thinking and planning all the conservation aspects of cave dwelling bat species here in the Neotropics. And I think that's basically it. Like, anybody has any questions?
Thank you, Hernani. That was super interesting. I'll give people a minute to type their questions in the chat. But in the meantime, I'll get started with a question just on the last point that you were making, that sort of interaction between the need to protect caves, but also the need to protect the landscape around the caves. And just obviously it's sort of different resources for the bats. So they need the caves for roosting and they need the surrounding area to forage on. So yeah, I just wondered, what do you think the relative importance is of protecting the caves and protecting the landscapes, and how that could be sort of implemented practically? Is it enough to protect the cave? Is that the priority, or do we really need to also think about the surrounding areas?
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated issue. Like for some species that might have higher home ranges, like this might not even be important because they can move like to other places. So they might be roosting the place, but actually feeding in another area. So they might be able to move around. But for smaller species or potentially species that have smaller home range, cave conservation, but also surrounding cave conservation is something that's super important. It seems to be like at least we haven't tested this like in reality. We haven't gone there to test like this, but I think it's especially for the species of bat species with small home range, you protecting the caves not enough. You need to protect the surrounding of the caves for the species to have habitat for feeding and moving. Like some species, they move between caves as well. So you need to make sure that the caves are connected as well. It's something that I didn't say, but happens with a lot of species. There are movements between colonies that they may need to remain connected if you want to have, well, genetic variation and things like that. You know, that's another thing. But also, especially for these species such as Loncophila decaceria, which is strictly cave roosting bat species. So if you deforested the surroundings of the cave, probably the species is going to disappear. If you destroy the cave, doesn't have anywhere to roost. So it's a very complicated issue. And Cerrado is a biodiversity hotspot. I forgot to mention that. But so it's also highly threatened, and it's the deforestation rates. Sometimes it's even higher than the Amazon. So things have been disappearing here very quickly. But just to answer, I think quickly your question, I think has been some attempts here in Brazil to create bigger areas to protect many kind of different caves. So when you found a cave, sometimes it's not only one cave, but it's a complex of different caves in a small area. So you can try to protect the surroundings of the caves, or at least the area where this complex of caves are, instead of just protecting a single cave or making legislation or things to protect single caves. I think it's more important to protect bigger places that surround us, like the caves, at least to make sure that these species that are cave dwelling, strictly cave dwelling, and have small home range, they're able to minimally be protected from these things. Because if you only protect the cave and you forget about the surroundings, I think will affect them very hard. And if you don't protect the caves, or anyway, there's only you need to think about ways about protecting whole complex of environments for these species. But also take into account the characteristics of these species, right? So if you have species that can roost other places or have higher home range as well, like so take into the species characteristics to plan these strategies.
Yes, definitely logistical and implementation challenges, but definitely I think we should aim for landscape scale or large scale protection of the areas. There's a question in the chat saying, thank you for the talk. Many bats in the Neotropic are not evaluated, so they are data deficient and are poorly evaluated by the IUCN. Is there any effort to improve the IUCN evaluations?
Yeah, so I know that Nancy Simmons is leading like a big effort to I think increase like the representation of some newly described bat species. I think Alice Hughes is also working on this. And I think I have a recent meeting with Alice, and she said that usually what species that have been considered data deficient by IUCN, when they are properly assessed, usually they are considered afterwards as vulnerable or endangered. So they are threatened. I mean, if you have a data deficient species, it's very likely to be already a threatened species, according to the IUCN. I have to say that I working like today in a project that I think we need to be a bit careful in terms of thinking about bad assessments. I'm going to be polemic here a little bit, but I think we need to be a bit careful in terms of these assessments for IUCN, because some of them are old, and some of them don't take completely into account the amount of protected areas within bad species and the land use change that are currently already gone to the distribution ranges. Like, so you may have a list concerned bad species which have been already heavily, their landscapes, like their distribution, have already been very largely altered across, like due to human activity, and also might be very lowly protected. So I think it's, yeah, data deficient species are usually already threatened when they are properly assessed. That's according to Alice, but I can imagine that's the case for any species. But also, I think we need to be careful in terms of dividing these concepts of, oh, this is a least concern, this is an endangered species, because bad species, they have different requirements, but also some of these assessments, they don't take into account some things that might be important for the conservation, such as not only the protection, the amount of protection of the distribution, but also the amount of protection of the distribution of the caves within the distribution. So I think all these things need to come into place for us to make a proper assessment, which is hard when you have so many bad species and so few money, right? Like to work on all of them. And well, we have a lot of bad researchers, but I think what lacks most is like the money, like, for us to do all the things that we want to do, to understand better the conservation. Sometimes the will, like, of the government to allow things to happen.
Definitely. Please feel free to type your questions, more questions in the chat if you have any for Hernani. I was also thinking about, so you talked a little bit about the importance of some of the characteristics of the caves in terms of how many species of bats they can host, like larger, longer caves, generally hosting more species. So you think that's, and I don't really know how much we know about cave systems, given the map that you show, that you said actually those gaps is presumably because no one has been there. So I don't know if we have any sort of more detailed information about the caves that we know about, to try and basically take a precautionary approach and sort of select caves that look like they could be really important for bats just based on their characteristics, even if there hasn't been a full species assessment on the site.
Yep. So Jennifer is also like she's the Jennifer Bowers, which I cited like in the talk. She's the bat BCI representative here in the Neotropical region in general, but also I think most specifically here in Brazil. And she published another paper saying that showing that looks like the thermal stability is something very important for species richness. So if you go to a cave, why longest caves are more important for hosting more bat species, for cave dwelling bat species? Because basically they seem to be more thermally stable. So if you have a smaller cave, it seems to be more fluctuating humidity, temperature, seems to be more affected by different factors on the outside environments. But once this cave starts to be longer, then it has the ability to keep itself cool, more stable, and this is to be more important for hosting more bat species within these caves. But interestingly, she evaluated the conservation of the surroundings of the caves, and now she went to the field. I didn't went to the field. I made an estimation of the surroundings of these caves and the protection of them, the land use change for this species from Confila de Queseri to estimate and discuss about what could be the impact for the species conservation, right? But Jennifer actually went to the caves and measured things for 19 caves here in Brazil. And what she found is that for some species, the surrounding cave conservation seems to not be that important for the bat conservation, of the cave dwelling bat species conservation, at least not all of them. Some of them they are, but for some of them, they might not seem to be that important, which I think falls in that range that I was saying, that I think for some species, small ranges, home ranges surrounding the caves, like the surroundings of the caves are more important for the conservation of the species as well. But if you have like bigger species that are able to move more across the landscape, then I think the surroundings of the caves might be less important for the conservation. So there is different things that we need to take into account when thinking about these things, and also things that we don't know exactly. Like, I mean, what are the causes of having different species richness for different types of caves? You know, like if the caves is made of magmatic thing or iron, what's the impact for this has for cave conservation and for the bat conservation in terms of the characteristics of the caves for hosting species. So I think there's a lot of room for a lot of discoveries and a lot of things that we don't know exactly. We don't understand exactly yet. And that's basically because there's too many caves, too few people, and it's still, if you think that we only know less than 10% of the caves of Brazil estimated to happen in Brazil have been discovered so far. And from this 10% that have been discovered from the estimated ones, only 3% have been studied for bats. We have 300,000 caves in Brazil estimated to exist. We have 23,000 caves that we have discovered. And from these 23, we have 500 more or less that we have studied for bats. So it's a very narrow, like sampling size that we're describing patterns for like huge regions, right? So I think we need to be cautious with anything that I'm talking here, but so far that's what we have been digging so far.
Yeah, just the tip of the iceberg, but big challenges ahead.
Yep.
Lots of questions, more questions for bat researchers. Yeah,
that's one of the things that I discussed with her, because in her paper, she says that if a species only happen once, like in a cave, it's not a cave dwelling species. But one of the things that I told her is like, how do you know? You know, like we know so little about, I mean, that's the best thing that we can say right now, right? But I think we need to be careful in terms of making too strong statements about from this data, because we know so little about like the caves and also the bats within these caves, right? Like, so I think everything that I was saying right now is the best that we can say, but we need to be very careful. Also for our data as well, like all the data that we have published with Prisma as well. We have published it based on a smaller sampling size than what could be done if we include all the caves and things like that. So a much smaller sampling size. So yeah, my take-home message is that we need to be aware of these things and dig these patterns, but we need to be careful in making very strong statements, because there's so much that we don't know about them still.
Yeah, so definitely more research needed. And I think that's probably a good point to end the conversation today. So just to say thank you very much again, Hernani, for a super interesting talk and for your time today. And just a reminder to everyone again, well, firstly, thank you for joining us for this webinar and for previous webinars again. There's the link in the chat. If you are able to donate, we'd be very grateful. And so thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that you'll continue to join us. The webinars will be back next year, so we hope to see you all again then. Thanks very much, everyone, and thanks, Hernani.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye. See you next year.
Great. Thank you.